Good evening and welcome to our Cows and Chaos Feed, Forage and Management Strategies webinar series. My name is Dean Dick, Farm Management Specialist with the Ag Info Center in Stettler, and I will be moderating the webinar tonight on using hayland for grazing as well as water quality and supply. Our speakers tonight are Karen Lindquist, our Forage Bee Specialist at the Ag Info Center, and Joe Harrington, our Water Specialist in Lethbridge. So a couple of housekeeping items before we begin here. First is that the webinar is being recorded and you'll be able to watch it via a link. You'll receive the link in an email tomorrow. Secondly, if you want to ask questions, just look for the question panel on the GoToWebinar control panel and type in your questions, and we will address those questions at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, we're going to have Karen begin our webinar on using hayland for grazing. Karen.
Thanks, Dean. So way I like to start these things is that I always like to ask, well, why do you do a certain thing? So for this point in time, for this presentation, why graze hayland? This year we've been seeing quite a bit of pasture shortage with the stress from this spring. A lot of cows being turned on to pasture a little bit earlier than we hoped they would. So anticipation of inadequate pasture going into the fall is certainly a reason. Second reason is potentially what I would call the unfavorable hay situation, which is where the moisture conditions have come so much over these past 2-3 months, where the hay has not been able to get off in time. It's just been too wet to get anything off to really cut, or only be able to take that first cut if you're lucky, and then now you're kind of waiting and deciding whether should you take that second cut later on, or maybe you should graze it. Third reason, common reason, is the aspect of extending the grazing season, and that is basically just bringing the animals to the forage instead of bringing the forage to the cows, and that's always a cheaper way to go, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on here. So just some things to know and what I'm going to be going through tonight. Some advantages and disadvantages of grazing hayland. That critical growth period folks should know about, especially with alfalfa, because most hayland has that alfalfa in it. The bolt risks that are associated with grazing hayland, slow introduction that's needed, and some management strategies for grazing alfalfa. So when we look at it, the advantages of grazing a hayland, we wonder, well, okay, what are some good things about it? Of course, livestock, of course, are great at making use of a high quality resource. So having legumes in the stand add pounds at a certain, a lot of the pounds per acre with calves, or with good, they also add a good condition to cows going into the winter time. So it's always a huge plus. The second reason is it's always cheaper to graze. That always encourages the decrease in feed costs, and of course the fact that you're just not having to spend so much time feeding, especially this time of year. Like I said earlier, the cows have been going on to pasture earlier. The shortage in pasture, which means that the cows that you have to be feeding cows earlier in the year than usual. So having a little bit of an advantage of maybe utilizing those hay stands is sort of like an insurance, and where you have another extra forage resource where the pastures are falling short. And again, another advantage is extending the grazing season, which certainly shortens that feeding period. And finally, one of my favorite ones is that it adds fertility to the hay stand via manure. Now, there's some obvious disadvantages with grazing hayland. Bloat is certainly a #1 disadvantage. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. To think certain points like alfalfa certainly isn't bloat free after frost. It isn't even bloat free in hay. And of course, with the bloat risk, there's always that animal selectivity for legumes over grass. That is something to keep in mind and to not necessarily worry about, but like I said, just keep in mind. Secondly, some people may find that grazing hayland certainly requires management, and some people may think that maybe that's a bad thing. That's their thing, but because it requires management, it certainly does mean that you have to make sure you're on top of making sure that those introductions are slow enough so that you are mitigating bloat, you have enough water for those animals, your fencing is up to par, and you're on top of timing when to move animals, especially if you're doing a rotational grazing kind of system. Now, the critical growing period of alfalfa is basically it's that time period between when it could be used as a first cut to when it that time in usually in the fall where we could probably take the second cut, but then again, no. This critical growing period is really important because it just allows those plants to get those root reserves accumulated right before winter. And this critical growth period here in Alberta is from August 1st to September 15th, or we usually like to say that 45 to 60 day period. So that root reserve, letting those plants accumulate the root reserve, is very critical for stand longevity and for decreasing the chance of winter kill. Of course, a great way to kill out alfalfa is to ignore this critical growing period, but that's for the rare time when you really don't want alfalfa in your stand, which is, well, I've heard of that on sometimes, but it's not all the time. So allowing those plants to get those root reserves certainly gives those plants that needed energy stored in their roots over the winter time for spring regrowth. And that's important because when you get to see all those alfalfa plants coming back in the spring, that means that, hey, there's another great crop of hay to take off in the next year, and so on and so forth. So really, it's managing for the alfalfa. The plant growth, especially the plant growth that's going to be slowing down by or after mid-September, is actually a good thing with regards to grazing, or even if you're on a little bit separate topic of considering haying after that critical growth period. So when that plant growth slows down, that means that those plants are going into dormancy, and when that happens, those plants are not going to be responding so quickly after cutting or grazing, just because they're not the photo period is not quite right for them, and the light is, the lights and the temperature more than anything, that those cold fall nights are certainly going to be slowing down their growth. So, and then on top of that, when you get those killing frost, which is -5 degrees Celsius or lower, is certainly going to be killing alfalfa, which further forces that plant into dormancy. Now, second point in magic for alfalfa is overgrazing, and it hurts not just alfalfa, it also hurts the plants. And that is certainly important when going, and even for plants that are going into winter, you need enough plant residue to hold the snow. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And of course, overgrazing can damage crowns, and that can compromise the plants. You don't see it right away, but it shows up the next year, or even possibly the year after when you really start noticing it. So now we got to talk about bloat risk, because the big B word people are scared about. It's something that certainly needs to be talked about when grazing hay stands. It is definitely the significant fear factor and the greatest inhibitor to actually grazing these stands, primarily because alfalfa, along with clover, is certainly infamous for causing bloat. But the thing is that management is key to mitigate that bloat risk. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the bloat risks that come with the grazing hay stands is that fall frosts make for a high risk for bloat, and this is with the green plants. And the primary reason the fall frosts make alfalfa a higher risk than if there's no frost, and even when those plants are full flower, fully mature, is because of the freezing action that happens in those cell walls. So we all should know that when water freezes, it expands, and these plant cell walls are brittle, so they can hold a certain amount of pressure within their contents. But when the freezing happens and those cell contents freeze up, those contents expand so much those cell walls cannot hold it so much. So they build up, the pressure builds and builds and builds, and all of a sudden, boom, those cell walls burst. And that release of cell contents make those plants a lot more easier for the rumen microbes to digest, because the soluble protein and of course the soluble carbohydrates are more readily available. So that can make for a bit of a disaster, especially if you're not prepared for that kind of thing. And we all know too that young alfalfa is certainly a higher risk than dead dry material that's early in the year. I just wanted to make note of, just point this out just before I go on to talk about that dead dried stuff. Young alfalfa obviously has that high rate of digestibility, that high soluble protein carbohydrate amount, and of course it has the low lignin and fiber content. Now you're somewhat safer with bloat with alfalfa grass mix stands, because the grasses add that fibrous material that the cows can select for. I mean, they can self-medicate themselves if they feel like their stomach is to feel like a little bit of a bellyache coming on. But the thing is that animals will still tend to be selective. There's something in their system, in their minds, that okay, I don't like eating this headed out grass. I'm going to go for this alfalfa that tastes a little bit better. It just makes me feel a little bit more alive and all that, and that may not be when the animals eat that, they're not thinking about, hey, I'm going to have a stomach ache after this, I shouldn't eat that. They're going to eat this, and I like this because I like the taste, and they, like I said, they don't think about what happens after that. So going back to that mature stands, those mature stands are going to be reducing the bloat risk, but it's not bloat free. And these mature stands certainly have that higher fiber lignin content. the cell walls thicken so that that higher fiber content is there. It has a lower digestibility, protein, and energy content, and of course a lower rate of digestion. But that just because the mature stands are turning brown doesn't mean that those it's still going to be completely bloat free. There's still enough of a digestibility where especially if not introducing them properly, you can still run into some problems with bloat. And that's a great segue. So for fast introductions, the real train wreck that happens is you're putting in on hungry animals, and the animals were on something that was even poorer than what they're putting on. Sorry. So let me try that again. So if you're putting the animals on this hay stand, which is a little bit better quality than what were they on before, like if it was a fully mature pasture, grass pasture that was native grass pasture that was just really mature, not much they can get from it, that could certainly have an impact on them. Also, another factor is whether you're putting them on green and young plants, alfalfa plants, or whether this is dead and brown down. It's been a couple of weeks after that frost has killed those plants. Morning or late afternoon, best time to get bloat. I hate to say this, but is if you put them right first thing in the morning. It's always something in the morning, is that it just makes it for higher bloat potential then. And of course, moisture content on the forage. If there's dew, if it was rainfall, that water helps make those plants a lot more digestible than if they were dry. So grazing management is really important with the hay stands, and I always stress that probably the most important aspect of grazing management with hay stands is the fact of introducing them slowly onto the stand. It's really good to make sure that they're not hungry. They're not eagerly looking for extra feed when you're putting them out there. So feeding them up with some hay, or making sure that they graze their fill on another piece of land before you put them into this hay stand will be really good. Also great to do is to put a bale of hay or straw out for the first 3 to 5 days if you can do that, or some also make sure that those cows have access to another alfalfa free grazing alfalfa free area for them to graze, just to kind of self-medicate. Putting them into the late afternoon also works well. That moisture will be burned off by the sun enough so that those plants are nice and dry when they go in there. The other key thing is, once they're in, leave them in. You can have higher bloat risk if you're putting them in the day and then all of a sudden you decide to take them out at night. When you put them back in the morning or in the late afternoon, is that you will have to start yourself all over again, where you're going to have to be making sure that they're not hungry when they're going in. They have access to another source of roughage. Otherwise, if you're not going to be following up with that, you could run into some problems with some bloating animals. Finally, keep an eye on them is good, because during that first week, you'll figure out which one are your chronic bloaters and which ones are going to be doing just fine on that stand. Now, when you've done all the introductions, you're all finished that. The question comes now, okay, so they're in there. How long do I keep them in there? When do I pull them out? Now that take half, leave half mantra is a great thing to keep in mind. But that's, in my opinion, that's not good enough. The key thing here, I have it in bold, is to make sure when you're pulling those animals out is that there is at least 4 to 6 inches of residue left behind. So in other words, those cattle are only going to be taking tops of the plants, maybe the top third of the plants, maybe half if you have to get them to go that much, but make sure you got that, leave enough residue behind so that there's that snow catchment and there's enough, their plants are not going to be forced to get so much reserve, especially if the fall, sometimes you get some fall times where the days are nice and warm, plants are starting to feel a little good, they starting to grow a little bit, and then they're going to be having to use some root reserves to grow a little bit more leaf. No, if you leave a bit of residue behind, if you leave a bit of that solar panel behind, that'll be really good for the plants. Even though you probably, if you're really stressed, you like to take as much of that stand as possible. But when you're thinking about longevity of that hay stand, that's where that residue, leaving that residue is going to be really important. To help with that, especially in the bigger fields, setting up cross fencing for rotational grazing all those other names, is probably going to be beneficial as anything else. That cross fencing, that rotational grazing sets you up where you're going to get higher stock density, you get more concentration of animals on a smaller piece of land, and those animals are going to be having to select a lot less for those plants versus if they're spread out on a bigger area. So that means that they're not going to be picking more of that alfalfa. They're going to be forced to just a different herd dynamic where they're just going to be eating a lot more of the grasses and the legumes. Great if you have, perfect if you have a mixed stand, and that way they're, like I said, they're just not going to be selecting so much for the alfalfa over grass. The other great advantage of that too is better distribution of grazing and trampling, and better distribution of manure over in those paddocks. Another great thing to keep, a possibility that you could probably do, is a swath grazing. So just go in there to the hay stand with a hay bine or swather and swath it down. Let that swath wilt for 24, 48 hours before you put the animals on there, and that would also help clean everything up. Make sure you set the swather so that you're leaving a high swather or the hay bine at that 4 to 6 inch residue, so as high as you want, high as you can, and that way that the forage is laid down, those animals are going to clean all that up, and it also helps the plants, because when their plants are wilted down, they're going to be drying up a little bit more, and that also reduces that bloat risk. So it's something to keep in mind if you can, if you're not in a wet area where you can't get in there, if you're not in a wet area where you can actually get in there with a machine and get it swathed, that'd be great. So just to sum everything up, best to graze this hay stand after that critical growth period, after that September 15th period, especially here. Bloat certainly makes things quite risky, but management, as I talked before, definitely alleviates that risk. And when you alleviate using that management, that means making sure you're slowly introducing the animals onto the stand will certainly mitigate that bloat risk. And of course, finally, leaving lots of residue behind for snow for snow and for plants coming back in the spring will certainly set you up for a stand that's going to last you for a long time. So Thanks for listening.
Good, thanks, Karen. Excellent presentation. Lots to think about there. So right now we're going to just do a little handoff here. We're going to change the presenter to Joe Harrington. And once we get, there we go. And Joe.
Okay.
Go ahead.
You can hear me, Dean?
Yep, you're good to go.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Joe Harrington, and I work out of the Lethbridge office of Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, and I'm an ag water specialist. I'm one of 5 water specialists located around the province, and myself and my colleagues are, basically provide support to agriculture producers, helping them with their water supplies, and that's for all sorts of supplies, so whether it's for livestock, also for household, those sort of things. And tonight I'm going to talk about just a very quick overview of water supply and water quality and how it relates. Primarily I'll talk about livestock, but it could be anything. And because this is a relatively short presentation, I got to go pretty quickly and just briefly touch on a few things, sort of fly over at the 100,000 foot level. But the main gist of this is going to be, I'm going to be talking about planning. And the importance of planning water supplies. So like most everything else in life, the best and most consistent beneficial results come from planning ahead. And so really planning allows you to take an inventory of what you have, what do you need, and a consideration of any of the challenges and or concerns that you may have in making your plan work. In other words, having a good water supply. So I'm really going to talk about three fundamental things within that tonight. So talk about the physical water supply and what we might want to think about when we're planning to obtain a water supply or what we're going to use. And then I'll talk just briefly about the legal access to it. This is often a neglected area. Producers often don't consider this. So I'll briefly touch on that. And then I'll probably spend the most time talking about water quality. These are such big subjects that I could talk for hours on just water quality. So I'll just briefly touch on a few of the main issues and hopefully give you something, a few tidbits that you might remember and help you understand water quality around your farm. So I guess first of all, we want to inventory all the existing water sources and possible water sources. And so we break it down for us water specialists, we'll generally look at each type of water source individually. So there's groundwater, and you would know that as well water or springs, those sort of things. In other words, water that comes out of the ground is groundwater. And then surface water, and that's overland type water, so spring melt, rainfall, creeks, dugouts, rivers, those sort of things, and the irrigation districts because they get the outfall out of the mountain snow melt. So really it's about having water where it's needed, when it's needed, and that's really and a quality that is useful. So that's really what we're looking for. And so one really needs to think and plan ahead when it comes to having water where you need it, when you need it. And so reacting to dry conditions after it happens is really a recipe to add stress in one's life. And it was also an easy path to spend more money than if you had planned ahead. We all live in Alberta, and I think all of us have experienced dry conditions before, and almost certainly it will happen again. If it hasn't happened, if it's not happening to you now, it will. And I'm in the south here, and it is pretty dry, although I know a lot of you are probably experiencing more than enough water. So it is highly variable, and we need to plan ahead, and really, because planning is really key to being ready. So I guess really first of all, we want to when we're planning a water supply, once we've inventoried them, we want to, so the cost of developing it, we want to estimate and compare those costs of development for each if you have more than one water source available, or even you just may be able to compare the costs of different type of developing that water source. So often we get focused on just doing one thing, you know, drilling another well or getting another dugout out there, or those sort of things, and we sometimes miss some things that could be more economical. So sometimes our first thoughts, our first plan on this, it really might not be the best way. And so that's often what our role as water specialists will do. We'll actually have the producer slow down and think about all the other options. And one of the things that we often end up getting a producer to think about is shallow bury pipelines, because they go in pretty quick and easy. And you know, the $20,000 you're going to spend on a water well and putting a pump in it and bringing power or a solar system, you can do a lot with a pipeline and take water quite a ways. I've had producers in a 2-inch line run water 5 miles. You know, you can't pump a lot of water in a short period of time, but you can often you know, provide enough water for livestock. And so actually that 5-mile pipeline, that farmer used a pipeline plow similar to one in the photograph. And I believe he only spent about 3 days putting that whole project in. He was lucky he had really no real important road crossings, so it actually went pretty well for him. So, but you can also think there may be other things that you might consider if you're, you know, you're in a bit of a situation where you temporarily need to use something like hayland or whatever to pasture, but you might only do that once every 20 years, just when it gets really dry, or you know, or your herd numbers are higher than normal. You know, maybe doing all that work maybe doesn't make sense. Maybe you know, doing a temporary water source using our emergency water pumping program, renting that equipment that's available, or even hauling water you know, with your truck and to a tank and a trough. That might get you by for that 1 year and 20 years. But if you're doing that every year, or renting the pumping equipment from our department every year, it's probably time to think about doing something a little more permanent, and at the end of the day being more cost effective, and also reduce your stress level. So so when you have a supply, you know, and I'm mostly talking about dugouts here, you really, every water source you should protect, whether it's a spring or a well as well, but really protecting it is really very cost effective. So putting an off source watering system on it, a solar system or whatever, windmills, nose pumps, all those sort of things, they're all viable options. And you know, they are, yes, they cost money, but you know, what is that water source available? What is it, you know, what's it worth to you? You know, if you can't utilize that grass, or have to sell off some of your herd because you don't have enough water, because your dugout was mucked up by your cattle and they can't use the bottom 3 feet of it, you know, that what's that worth to you? So by you know, it's well proven that providing off-source watering systems will keep the cattle out of the dugouts, and they will last a lot longer. Plus, the water quality will be much better, and your herd will have a lot better health. So that's really key. I think most have figured that out, but there's still lots of producers that can help themselves a lot by installing off-source watering systems. So, okay, change gears here to the next, and that's just this one slide is just on talking about the legal access to our water resource. Now, this is a complex issue, but it is something that all producers need to consider when developing any water source. So this, because it's complex, this is one thing where I really recommend you give one of us water specialists a call, and we can help you, coach you through what you might have to consider, where you might go, and how to comply with the Water Act and other regulations. You know what, it is Alberta Environment and Parks are the regulators. They're the regulators of the Water Act, and so you'll often end up dealing with them. But talking to us beforehand can often relieve a little bit of stress on dealing with that side of it. So, but what the important couple things are is you need to understand that water is regulated under Alberta's Water Act. You don't own the water that's on your land. That's actually that's a public resource. It's owned by the Crown or the people of Alberta. They're the ones that so they so the right to access it is apportioned out through water licenses, and that's a system that we've used and probably will continue to use into the foreseeable future. And it's designed to try to be fair to everyone. Sometimes it doesn't seem that way, but you know, it's not a perfect system, but it does work. So really, you know, getting the proper licenses is important. It protects your business, you know, by having legal water rights and access to that water by getting the proper approvals and licenses. And so it's a similar idea as, you know, would you buy a car that didn't have a clear title for? You're really taking a risk if you don't have the proper water right, the legal water rights. How do you operate your business? Okay, enough about that, because like that's also we could spend time on. So I'll talk mostly about water quality here. This is where I'll spend most of the time here tonight. Okay, and it is, again, it's complex. I could talk for hours on this. So I'll just hit a few of the highlights. So really, the first thing is really understanding the quality of water that's required for your end use. So in this case, we'll talk about cattle, livestock now. There is lots of guides and fact sheets available online. A lot of them even done by our department. The one on the screen is an example, and you can Google that, or if you want water analysis interpretation for livestock, and it sort of lays out what's acceptable for different livestock, including cattle. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of this in a bit here. So you know, once you understand the qualities needed for your cattle, you'll want to compare that to the water quality you have to determine the suitability. And to do this, you'll need to test your water. That's critical. I find a lot of producers are a bit reluctant to test your water just because of the cost of it. But when you compare that to the value of an animal, and then when you start putting that as the value of that whole herd, it's really quite inexpensive. So really, you don't know until you test it. You don't know what you have, and you know, sometimes quality change, and it can catch people off surprise, you know, off guard. We have a rural water quality information it's an online tool that you can just after you take your test and get the results, you can get the test done by a private lab, and they give you the results. Sometimes they'll give you a little bit of paperwork for interpretation, but really there's probably a lot more to learn. And so you can input these values into our rural water quality information tool, and you can find out by just doing an internet search on the term Alberta Rural Water Quality Information Tool. Our website's a little tough right now to find stuff, so that's the easiest way. And just plug those results in, and then it'll give you warnings that that particular parameter is not within specs, those sort of things. And it also gives you some suggestions on where to look to what you might do about it, those sort of things. And really I recommend, though, that you contact one of us ag water specialists. We're here to help you with that, or a beef specialist. We can generally always help you interpret that and try to make sense of it for you. So I guess so the test results are there's sort of two sides to it. There's the chemical parameters and the biological parameters. And so we'll talk a bit about chemical parameters first here. So it's the concentration of the minerals and salts and those sort of things in your water. And so that's both surface and groundwater. And generally, the levels of the chemicals do not change dramatically. In especially groundwater, well water, generally the quality stays generally pretty similar for long periods of time. You don't have to worry about it too much unless you have a well problem. You know, if the casing rusts through or something, sometimes you'll see a rapid change. But typically, we look at the total dissolved solids and alkalinity, and the total dissolved solids includes sodium and sulfate, and those are probably the things that seem to cause the most problems, and where we've seen there's a lot of wells around Alberta that does have high sodium and or high sulfates, and the sulfates in particular really seem to cause the problems. Anything above 2,500 milligrams per liter is really considered unsuitable, although I have talked to lots of producers that are using water higher than that. It's just not great for the herd health, and they're just probably not doing as good as they can. Now, there's no real economical way of treating it. Reverse osmosis is really the only real method, and that's not really suitable for livestock use. So you really, if you have high sulfate levels, it often means either dilution by bringing in better quality water or just moving them off the water source. So I want to kind of just mention a little bit about dugouts then with high sulfate levels, sodium and sulfate levels. And you'll often see that if you're in an area where you have a lot of soil salinity, you know, the salt flats, the alkali flats, you're almost always going to see high sulfate levels. Those saline flats are often sodium sulfate, and so the sulfates will often high. And you do have to pay attention throughout the year. Dugouts, as they evaporate down, the salts do not evaporate with the water, so it ends up the concentration gets higher and higher. And that's actually what happened a couple of years ago in southern Saskatchewan when they had that wreck. There was a couple hundred animals died because they moved it into an area that had a dugout that had evaporated down to where the sulfate level was higher than acceptable, and as a result, a bunch of animals died, got sick and died. So you definitely want to pay attention to that. Okay, I'll move on to biological parameters. So yeah, we do, you know, it is a complex issue, and there often is a moving target. You know, there are many pathogens that can be an issue, but the most common biological issue that comes across my desk is with producers worried about blue-green algae. And so blue-green algae is technically not an algae. It looks and acts like an algae, and it's always been called an algae. Historically, it's been called that, but it's a bacteria, and it's a cyanobacteria. And so I like to use the word cyanobacteria. I don't like to use the blue-green algae because it kind of gets your head thinking about it's something different than algae. And so I'll talk a little bit how it's different and how you want to be treating it. So cyanobacteria is often, very, very often toxic to animals. It's really about the level of cyanobacteria has a toxin in the cell structure, and there are, to a seminar I went recently, the expert was saying he had cataloged approximately 133 different types of cyanobacteria in Alberta. So it is very common. In fact, most surface water dugouts have cyanobacteria in them, so you definitely got to watch for that. And it can change from hour to hour, the concentration level, as the toxins in the cyanobacteria cell structure, as it's released from the ruptured cell wall when that cyanobacteria dies, whether naturally or artificially from treatment, those toxins can come out and cause problems for animals and be at a toxic level and actually kill animals. So I think most of you probably have run into that or heard about it, and it is very real. Every year we get a number of calls where people where producers have had problems with blue-green algae poisoning. I would call it cyanobacteria poisoning. So I often get asked, how do I tell? Visually, not really reliable. Testing, you can test for it, but again, that's not reliable because that can change from hour to hour, and also just the toxin levels can also change hour by hour. So really, if you have green in your dugout, you basically, the best you can hope to do is probably decide, is it algae or is it cyanobacteria? And so the two photographs, this is how I generally describe to producers how to tell. So many of the algae are filamentaceous types, so it's a stringy type, mossy type stuff. And so if you run your hand, put your hand down underneath it and then bring it up through with your fingers spread out like in a photograph, if it strings between it, it's likely an algae. If it all breaks apart and sticks little bits onto your glove, because you should use a glove, chances are it is a cyanobacteria, and I would just assume that it is a cyanobacteria and treat it accordingly. Move your animals off the water source, or do something like that because it can be deadly to your animals. So as you can see in the photographs there to the right, both of them upper and lower right, it has many different looks to it. It doesn't always look blue-green like the upper right-hand one there. You can see where it often will look blue as it's decaying, but you can't go by that. So treatment, how can you treat this? Okay, the first one's easy, pretty well for any of the salts, the sodium and sulfates. The only real solution is either move your cattle away from it or dilute it. That's the only economical solution. And unfortunately, that's the way the cookie crumbles. Cyanobacteria, it changes from hour to hour, as I said, or it can change from hour to hour. So I guess the big thing on here, the message I want to suggest to you is really avoiding it in the first place. And you can avoid it in the first place by providing a poor environment for it. And so that's why we always recommend aeration, because aeration really, what it does is it oxidizes the nutrients that's in the water, that's floating around in the water column, and it has to be floating around in there for this cyanobacteria that's also floating in the water. And that's how it absorbs those nutrients as an energy source. And so if you're aerating it, it oxidizes those nutrients and makes them settle to the bottom in a solid form where the cyanobacteria can't use it. And so that's really key. And just generally trying to exclude any of the nutrients you can. So on the bottom left-hand corner of there's a photograph of a product called a pond dye or a colorant, and that really all that's designed to do is it colors. It's a blue dye, and it's designed to block the ultraviolet light that the cyanobacteria use as a energy source. So so that can work, but if you do end up having to treat it with a copper product, make sure you follow the directions. Don't overdose your dugout, because that can cause lots of problems in future because you're killing off all the beneficial organisms in there. You don't want to do that, and the cyanobacteria is very intolerant to copper, so that's why it can be used. Just a little bit will actually kill cyanobacteria quite effectively. You just have to worry about it all dying off rapidly and then being at a toxic level for your livestock. And so that's why you always see in fact sheets about waiting for 2 or 3 weeks afterwards after you treat it. And it's not because of the copper, it's because of the potential for the cyanobacteria toxins to be at a toxic level. Okay, so my final slide here is really just to talk about The program, Canadian Agriculture Partnership, the Farm Water Supply program is up and running. That program is really all about promoting the idea of planning, which I've been talking about here, planning your water source well ahead, your water source developments. And so the program will fund certain types of water development projects, drilling wells, constructing dugouts, those sort of things. But it is important to know that planning is the big part, and it will only fund projects that are on a formalized long-term water management plan that you've completed for your farm operation, submitted to us water specialists for approval. Once we've approved it, then you could go ahead with the project. But that's the only way. If you go ahead and do the project before you have the long-term water management plan approved, then we can't fund that project. So I recommend you go to the CAP website and take a look, or you can talk to one of us water specialists by getting a hold of us through the Ag Infra Center through the 310 farm number. Okay, I think that's pretty much wraps up my presentation. So again, I just wanted to remind you, you can get us through the Ag Info Center at the 310-3276 number, and there's 5 of us water specialists around the province. So Dean, back to you.
Good. Thanks, Joe. Excellent information. Very lots of detail and lots of really good things that producers can use. So we do have some time for questions, and like I said, mentioned previously, if you want to ask a question, just type the question into the question area on your GoToWebinar control panel. So we'll get Karen back online here. So the first question we have is for Karen. When managing cattle grazing alfalfa, can I use Alpha Sure to manage bloat?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, that's definitely a good product to use the first few days, first week when putting animals on. Even though if you're putting out, that's one thing I also forgot to mention is that some of the recommendations out there that I've seen and that I probably would recommend is that putting animals out a couple weeks after killing frost is good, but even then, having some Alpha Sure is a great tool in the toolkit to have and to use, just to make sure that the animals are not going to be bloating on you so much when you're putting animals out on a hay stand like that. So yes, definitely.
Okay, good. Yeah, we've got about, like I said, about 10 minutes for questions here. And so I'll turn it back to Karen here. Any thoughts that came to mind that you think that you might have missed in the presentation that's important at all?
I think I covered everything.
Okay.
that I can remember. I think that last point that I had said about how those waiting a couple weeks after killing frost, because it's that killing frost, like I had said before, it makes those plants, especially the green stuff. I mean, I think most of the time, especially in this kind of rain belt, not sure for southern areas where it's been a bit drier, the plants are still going to be quite green, even though they're probably some of the fields are fully mature, already have some seed pods on them. They're still green, and when the frost hits them, like I said, those cell walls they burst, and it just makes it easier for the rumen microbes to digest if the animals are on the stand or put on the stand right after that frost period. So waiting a couple weeks to let the plants start dry down will I'd probably recommend that over and above putting animals in right after frost or just any time of the year, just because that's a further tool in the tool belt, I guess you could say, of mitigating bloat risk. So that was one quite important thing that I forgot to mention. So
Perfect.
put that out there for people to hear.
Thank you. Joe, anything you want to add here?
Well, yeah, I did actually miss one thing important that I just realized now. I didn't mention anywhere that it is critical to watch your healthier cattle when you put them on a new water source or a different water source. So, and that was, I guess, probably the big problem in Saskatchewan there is they put them in and didn't really go back and watch them fairly close. When you put them out, you want to watch them, your animals quite close for a period of a few days, and then after that there's less risk, but that first bit you just never know what's in that water, and testing could hopefully alleviate that, but you can't test for everything either. So that's probably the big thing I missed. Lots of other stuff I could talk about. I normally like to talk a lot more about protection and management of the water source as you're utilizing it. But yeah, I could talk for forever on that stuff. So good enough for now.
Good enough for now. We'll have to do another webinar on this, just so that we can get the word out. So, okay, no other questions are coming, so we're going to close out the webinar here. And just a couple of reminders here. Again, you'll be receiving an email tomorrow with a link to this webinar, just in case you missed something over this past hour. As soon as we close this out, you will probably get a survey on your screen. So we would appreciate you giving us your feedback, any additional topics that you want covered, because we like to get the information out. This is the best way of getting it out. And lastly, our next webinar is August 29th, debunking the myths of feeding alternate feeds, salvage crops, and unusual feeds. And that wasn't the last thing. If you want to, we post these webinars on our YouTube channel, the Alberta Agriculture and Forestry YouTube channel. So check them out. And we've got all the past ones that we've done in the past number of weeks. So with that, I'm going to close out the webinar. I'd like to thank Karen and Joe for some excellent presentations and information. So with that, have a good night.